Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. One of the nice things about interviewing authors on this show is one always sees a narrative arc. They go from one book to another. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. My guest today is well known as the author of a book called Notorious RBG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Came out in October 2015, almost 10 years ago, actually exactly 10 years ago. Irin, Carmon, the book has done extremely well. It's got over 8,000 reviews on Amazon, which is quite an achievement. It's been 10 years since Notorious RBG, and now Irin has a new book, very different kind of book, but in some ways connected. It's called Unbearable: 5 Women and the Perils of Pregnancy in America. Obviously in some ways connected, a book about women as well. And Irin is joining us from her home in Queens, New York. Irin, it's a long time since that last book. What's been occupying you? Is it children?
A few things have been occupying me. Well, you're right. There is a certain arc from Notorious RBG to this book. My entire career, I've had the honor of reporting on women's lives, on gender, on reproduction in America, whether that's through reporting on the Supreme Court, or on battles that take place in the political sphere or patients. After Notorious RBG came out, we were overwhelmed by the attention and by the interest. And so there were a few years of just, speaking about her all over the country, adapting the book into a museum exhibition, participating in documentaries. And it gave me a little bit of a chance to think about what I wanted to do next. It turned out that what I wanted to do next was report on Me Too. And so I spent a good chunk of time, 2017, 2018, reporting on sexual harassment, breaking the news of Charlie Rose, allegations of sexual harassment against Charlie Rose at the Washington Post, on his PBS show and at CBS, and the reporting appeared in the Washington Post. And I continued there reporting on that. I was hired at New York Magazine, covered the Kavanaugh hearings, all kind of this through line of gender and power, and continued to cover the fight over reproductive rights. And in 2020, when I was pregnant, COVID took over the world, restrictions thereof. And I started reporting on what was happening in hospitals. Because I was pregnant, I was particularly interested in what was happening with pregnancy and birth. So I started reporting on the policies at different hospitals in New York, where I lived, and which was the epicenter. Women were giving birth by themselves. Babies were being taken away from COVID-positive mothers. And it helped me understand the kind of breadth of issues, particularly because that year there was a spike in maternal mortality in the United States that was related to complications from COVID and also related to hospitals being really strapped. A lot of existing inequalities came up. When the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case that overturned Roe v. Wade in the fall of 2021, I was obviously covering it on a day-to-day basis for New York Magazine and thinking about the interrelations between the different things that I'd been writing about, the different things I'd been reporting on, and what I'd been living. And so when that Supreme Court decision leaked in May 2022, I was 6 months pregnant with my second child, and I began to see how interrelated all of these different battles for power over reproduction, whether it was somebody who was seeking an abortion or somebody who wanted to carry to term but wanted to be treated as something other than a vessel or a liability or a cog in the machine. So I had a great honor and opportunity to spend as long as I did figuring out what the next book would be. And I realized that I wanted to write something that took into account how interconnected the struggles over abortion and the experience of people who wanted to stay pregnant were in this country, and to do so through narrative reporting, through history, and through policy.
The book is about 5 women and the perils of pregnancy in America. You're not one of those 5 women, but you spend some of the book and in other articles, particularly one in the New York Times from last month, writing and thinking about yourself as a mother. You wrote a guest essay for the Times entitled "What I'd Tell a Younger Version of Myself About Having a Baby." Did the experience of writing this book change your view of motherhood?
I think it clarified some of my thinking, but I think that becoming a mother deepened my commitment to bodily autonomy and to patient rights, and understanding that, we tend to think about abortion policy over here, infertility, people who use drugs when they're pregnant, how people are treated when they're giving birth. We tend to think of these as all very separate. But I think that becoming a mother, I kind of felt in my bones when the Supreme Court made that decision. Even though I wasn't seeking and didn't need an abortion, it felt like this embodied experience of being pregnant at a time where pregnant people were losing rights, uh, gave me a new way of seeing things, gave me a way to understand that the separation between these different experiences of reproduction are really a matter of law and policy, and they don't even exist in medicine. So something that is called an abortion in one context can be called miscarriage management in another. And that the way that both the state and the way medicine is practiced in the United States limit the amount of rights that you have the moment you become pregnant is true across a lot of different experiences of pregnancy. So I think it didn't so much change it as being a mother changed how deeply I felt that all of these needed to be illuminated together. And, to be honest, I'm a little bit uncomfortable most of the time writing about myself. I don't think that my experience is particularly extraordinary. But what I wanted to do was to show how my own experiences, alongside my 15 years of reporting on this, gave me a passionate lens. I felt like it was kind of transparency for the reader to say, here's where I'm coming from. And there are a lot of times in the book that the reason that I'm there is because I'm explaining how it is that even when I wasn't looking for it in my reporting, these stories kept emerging on their own. So I write about attending a preschool picnic for my daughter in the fall of 2023 and being asked about what I was working on. And I was trying to kind of keep it neutral because I didn't know anybody there very well. And I just said, it's about how you're treated when you're pregnant. And immediately, these women that I either didn't know at all or barely knew started saying, like a child, like an animal, like a child animal. And
This
when I
was in
learned,
Queens, was it?
yes, this was in Queens. And I was so struck by the fact that we tend to think of, oh, okay, somebody in a red state struggles to be treated respectfully or have access to their options when they get pregnant. But we don't think of it as being something, or I didn't even reporting on this as much as I did, think about it at how deeply it would resonate across geographic lines, class lines, political lines, even, because some of the women that I write about came from conservative backgrounds. And so I, through that, ended up going to coffee with one of those women by chance while I was trying to investigate a public hospital in my community, Woodhull, which simultaneously had a reputation for offering respectful midwifery care. And there was a disturbing pattern of Black women dying in preventable accidents or in botched procedures at that hospital. And I was trying to figure out how to tell that story. And I went to coffee with one of those women after drop off, and she said to me, well, I almost died when I was giving birth. And I thought she was kind of being hyperbolic, but it turns out she needed a full body blood transfusion and she had lifelong hormonal damage or lasting hormonal damage. And when I asked her, where did this happen? She said, Woodhull Hospital. And that was Maggie, one of the 5 women that I write about. And so I thought it would actually add to the story of the book if I explained how, in many cases, the way that I encounter these stories before I let them take over fully into their narrative, take over fully, I would be as sparing as possible, but I would also use it to explain just how ubiquitous this feeling of disrespect is across different, again, geographies and experiences of pregnancy. And so when I was postpartum with my second daughter in the summer of 2022, I read about Haley Burns, another one of the women that I write about. And she too had given birth in the summer of 2022. But because she tested positive twice for drug use in her pregnancies, she had struggled with addiction. She was in and out of treatment with addiction. Instead of being offered support or addiction services, she was arrested 6 days after giving birth in her son's hospital room. And so I also felt that this was one way in which I talked about the universality of these experiences. There was one way in which I also needed to kind of state my different perspectives, my sort of, for lack of a better term, check my privilege, but also think about how deeply I experienced the sadness and the separation in sympathy and in solidarity with her. Because even though there were so many differences between us, it felt like I felt a deep connection to her and how hard that must have been for her to suffer that separation and to, instead of recovering from birth and bonding with her baby, to spend 2 months sleeping on a concrete floor, bleeding out with untreated postpartum depression. And the reason that I wrote that essay is because Unbearable is a book about what America can do better when it comes to pregnancy care. But I also wanted to make sure that, a balanced perspective was out there. It's both in the book, in the lives of the people, but also in my own experience. And I think, the headline, as you know, headlines are a collaborative experience. Often the writer doesn't write them. The headline was what I'd tell a younger version of myself about having a baby. But the way that I conceived of it, so to speak, was about, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my children in the background.
Yeah, we can. Well, it's probably usually kids interfere with interviews, Irin, but in this one, it probably it's part of the soundtrack, isn't it?
Right. It's on topic. Yes, their dad is putting them to bed. So the let's see, where was I?
Well, let me.
I just wanted to
let me ask.
I thought of that essay as a pointer to the pronatalist discourse, is what I wanted to say. I thought of it as you only hear anything positive as being a right-wing discourse, and I wanted to offer a more nuanced perspective on parenting and pregnancy.
I'm sure you saw an interesting review of the book in Free Press by Cara Kennedy. She acknowledges that your numbers are troubling in some ways, but she also points to your New York Times piece suggesting, and I'm not sure whether this is fair or not, you can perhaps comment on this, that progressives can't bear pregnancy, you being an example of a progressive. Is there any truth in this critique from Kennedy?
Well, I feel like everything that I had to say about a balanced perspective about pregnancy is in my work. I would just say, I'm glad that she had a really good experience giving birth in the US. The reality is that the US makes pregnancy so much more dangerous and more difficult than our peer nations, regardless of how you count pregnancy related complications and deaths, because there's arguments over the definition. Even when you offer the most conservative definition of risks and deaths around pregnancy, the US will rank at the bottom of our peer nations, and that is simply indisputable fact.
Yeah, and maternal mortality rates. I just saw an interview with you on MSNBC. deaths per 100,000 live births. I think this is Black Americans 50%, 50.3 per 100, way higher than everywhere else. Irin, this is obviously a very controversial subject. What number in particular, what items of data really make your point about the unbearable nature of being pregnant now in the United States?
Well, certainly the one that I just cited. And then I think also the ways in which opinions like Dobbs, decisions like Dobbs that empower more restrictions. There has been substantial reporting that people experiencing pregnancy complications are not getting the care that they need because of anti-abortion laws in place. So they're being denied access to ectopic pregnancy care. This is documented that this happened in Texas. They're being forced to go septic when they're having miscarriages. Texas finally changed its emergency definition. It's just gone into effect, I believe. It's been years of these emergency cases being documented to cause harm instead of people getting access to the care that they need. So I think there's a pretty powerful case to be made simply about maternal mortality, but it goes broader than that. Because the US has this experiment with letting half of the states ban abortion, I think it's pretty shocking that we've taken a bad situation and made it worse. By further circumscribing the rights of people who become pregnant. And then, that chart, it was a little confusing, that chart, to be honest, but it looked to me like it was also showing the racial disparities within the United States.
Yeah, and you've really worked on that. I know that's something that you underline in the book.
Yeah, so this is something that really inspired me to report on New York City, because currently in the United States, a Black woman is 3 or 4 times likelier to die. And then again, we're just talking about death. For every one death, there are 60 or 70 cases of maternal morbidity, which are severe complications relating to pregnancy, including hysterectomy, hemorrhage, sepsis. These all count under maternal morbidity.
So how does it compare from the Free Press article suggesting that that 19 in 100,000 women in the US die in childbirth, and the equivalent figure in the United Kingdom is almost 13. So it's higher, but not dramatically higher. How does it compare broadly with Europe? Is it dramatically different?
The US is always at the bottom of every ranking.
No, I understand that, but
yes, it is worse in Europe. That's what that means. Yeah, and so I just want to say that so the racial disparity within the United States, I think, is very important to be attentive to, and it's deeply connected to our history. What I was going to say is that the reason that I wanted to report on New York City is because although we are the wealthiest city in the country, one of the wealthiest cities in the world, and full of resources, full of world-class hospitals, the rate of racial disparity in New York City is worse than the country at large. So during the years that I wrote about in my book, a Black woman was 9 or 12 times likelier to die for childbirth-related or pregnancy-related reasons. And I think, that alone is a crisis. The other thing that the United States does that our peer nations doesn't do is lock up people, put them in jail for having drug problems while they're pregnant. So in Alabama, for example, in the last 2 years since Dobbs alone, there have been 412 pregnancy-related arrests in the United States, about half of them in Alabama, which is the reason I wanted to write about Alabama in my book. I don't believe that in our peer nations, when somebody is struggling with addiction, or even if they use drugs once during their pregnancy, they test positive for marijuana, they lose access to their children, they lose access to their freedom. Again, instead of being offered addiction support, no one is saying that this is a wonderful thing to be addicted to drugs during your pregnancy. But if you have a problem, is the best thing for you, or if you're still pregnant, your fetus, or your children, if they've already been born, for you to rot away in a jail cell? That is a uniquely American problem.
Yeah, and we've done many shows on the nature of the criminal justice system in the United States on lots of fronts. Your New York Times piece touches on the ideological battles here. You write about RFK Jr., J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, and their support for natality. The Economist just ran a piece entitled "Make America Procreate Again" amongst the MAGA fertility fanatics. How central, in your view, is fertility to the MAGA movement? Is it the core ideology at the heart of this movement, or is it just peripheral?
I do think it is core. I think it is not matched by a commitment to making it easier for people who want to have families to do so. But I certainly think it's part of the ideology because in many cases, it's very explicitly linked to eugenics and it's linked to their deportation mission. They would prefer that the people that they think count as Americans have babies within a very narrow framework of marriage and heterosexual marriage, and that they preferably be white, that they certainly do not consider the babies born to immigrants in this country to be American. And so I think it's intertwined with other elements of their ideology that are frankly white supremacist, pretty openly so. We want our people to have babies is something you hear pretty explicitly from them. But even if you take the racial and xenophobic aspect out of it, it is really interesting how many of these discussions, whether it's RFK, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, saying that it's a national security threat that people aren't having more children, or Trump has spoken about it more generally. He's just said we want more babies. They're going to be Trump babies. He's called himself the fertilization president. And Elon Musk has said many times that population is on the brink of collapse. He's shared misinformation about birth control. I think all of these conversations, they seem to be completely disconnected with the actual lived experiences of people who are figuring out whether they want to have kids, especially women. The only women I hear in these conversations seem to be sort of social media influencers and not in positions of power, with the possible exception of Katie Britt, the senator from Alabama, who convinced Trump to do a kind of symbolic IVF policy that will not meaningfully increase access to IVF. And so I do think that rhetorically it is very important, but it has not been matched with any kinds of policies that would make it easier either to have a healthy and safe pregnancy, to make decisions over your own pregnancy, or to raise a family.
You mentioned that one of the women, at least, that you write about in the book was or is a conservative. Did her experience in having in being pregnant in the United States, did it change her politics? I mean, there are, of course, a lot of so-called trad wives, a lot of women who now seem to think of themselves as their purpose is to have children, for better or worse. Men, of course, also are encouraging this. But in your experience in writing this book, did it change their politics?
Well, I don't know how many women are actually tradwives and how many people are just sort of consuming content about a life that seems appealingly simple, aesthetically beautiful. It feels to me more like a media phenomenon than people who are actually, dramatically changing their behavior at large. Apart from, it seems like it's a very visible subculture with a particular political salience to the president right now. I think I should say that Haley, the woman that I wrote about who was jailed after pregnancy, was raised in she lives in a conservative evangelical region and was raised in the church. And when she was considering whether to have an abortion, when she found out that she was pregnant the second time, even though she was partnered, she had a child, she did have this addiction problem, and she considered having an abortion. And her mother talked her out of it for religious reasons. And then she herself also decided that she told me that she was afraid of what it would be like when she met her maker if she had an abortion. But the tragic irony is that if she had had an abortion, which was just barely legal still in Alabama, if not so accessible, because this would have been the spring of 2022 and Roe was in June. Roe was overturned in June. Had she had an abortion, her pregnancy and her child would not have been used as evidence against her the way they were when she lost her freedom by being jailed repeatedly. And she still doesn't have custody of her children back, even though she's been clean for more than 2.5 years. And even though she's held down a steady job and she's got her own place. So the deep irony is that when abortion was legal in Alabama, they were actually incentivizing people to have abortions, lest their very pregnancies be used as evidence against them. I also write about a doula, a birth support person who's not a medical professional, but is trained to be a companion to people giving birth, who grows up in the anti-abortion movement. She's not one of the 5 women, but she's key to the story. Kirsten Clark is her name, and she's supporting women in birth in Alabama. And she, grew up tabling at anti-abortion meetings and wearing T-shirts about life and very much in the movement. And here's about another one of the women I read about, Dr. Yashika Robinson, as a doctor who is providing pregnancy and birth care where she actually listens to her patients and is willing to try to meet them where they are, provided that it's medically safe. Whereas the other doctors are kind of domineering and they bully their patients, and they're much more likely to perform a riskier C-section rather than be patient or explore options of informed consent with their patients. And so she winds up attending a couple of births with Dr. Robinson. And the thing is about this doctor is that the other people in the quote unquote natural birth community in Alabama won't work with her because she's also an abortion provider. And what you learn about from Dr. Robinson in the book is that she is a person who is motivated by the same values for as long as it's legal in Alabama to perform abortions, and also to treat her patients who want to give birth respectfully. Sometimes it's the same patient. And so Kirsten, again, this woman who grew up in an evangelical church, finds herself being so impressed by Dr. Robinson and thinking, if the doctor who is anti-abortion is also the one he's praying with his patients, but he's also my way or the highway in a way that she considers abusive. But here's Dr. Robinson, who's performing an abortion and then also making her patients feel heard and providing respectful care. And it actually leads her down a journey to change her mind about abortion and to actually become, again, for as long as it was legal in Alabama, an abortion doula. So she's working full-time, accompanying dozens of abortions over the course of, I think it was a few years, hundreds of abortions over time. Somebody who, again, was tabling at the Christian rock concerts to try to talk people out of abortion, changed her view just by seeing the way that abortion providers were being in the world. So I found that to be very powerful.
Irin, you've done a lot of reporting, not just on this, but on the Supreme Court and on lawsuits associated with a lot of these issues, particularly the Roberts Supreme Court. What would your friend, Notorious RBG, say about this? What would her take be?
Justice Ginsburg earned that nickname Notorious RBG because of a dissent that she issued in June 2013, protesting that John Roberts and the majority of the court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And I always think it's important to remember that that nickname was bestowed upon her when she was warning about what the court was doing, that she believed that the court had grievously done wrong in gutting democratically enacted legislation that she considered perfectly constitutional, that it was overturning important precedents, which it would obviously continue to do with even more abandon after she died. She was warning people. She wanted people to pay attention to what was going on. And so I think she would be very sad to have been validated of her worst fears. And of course, she stayed on the court too long. But I think she also believed that it was impossible that Donald Trump would win, and she misjudged the environment. But for as long as she could, she tried to prevent everything the court is doing now from happening.
Finally, a few years ago, I had Margaret Atwood on the show, of course, the author of many books. She has a new autobiography out, but perhaps best known for her Handmaid's Tale, which is a dystopian vision. I remember talking to her about, when she came on the show, talking to her about that book. And she explained to me that it was a book about America and it wasn't, in her view, science fiction. Are we where Atwood was warning us? Are we in this new dystopia? Is this really what you are revealing in Unbearable? It sounds like, in many ways, a nightmare world for women who are pregnant.
When we talk about the trad wives, I often think about The Handmaid's Tale, in which there were women whose jobs were to promulgate this brave new world, and then they found themselves with their own rights limited by it when it worked too well. I do think that in many ways, her vision was prescient. When Haley, one of the 5 women I write about, is jailed, she finds herself in a cell with 3 other pregnant women who are being charged with crimes against their own fetuses. So to me, that also kind of reeks of dystopian fiction.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's Atwood meets Kafka.
Yeah, yeah, because they also, like Kafka, they're also being saddled with impossible burdens to get out of jail. They need to have $10,000 in cash bail, something similar offenses does not carry, and they need to have a spot in rehab, but there are no spots in rehab available in Alabama because so many people are struggling with opioid addiction and not a lot of resources for them. And so a lot of the women get trapped there. Some of the women didn't even know they were pregnant. They were pulled over for speeding or something. Maybe there was a warrant against them. They drug test them, they pregnancy test them upon admission to the jail, and then they're trapped. I also think that one of the critiques of The Handmaid's Tale has always been also that the reality that The Handmaid's Tale describes was the reality under American slavery. It's just that in The Handmaid's Tale, it's being portrayed as happening to white educated women. And so I do write in the book a lot about the roots of American obstetrics and gynecology being the experimentation on enslaved women. Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy were 3 women who were held by J. Marion Sims, who is still celebrated as the father of obstetrics and gynecology. For years, they were experimented upon with no anesthesia, with no ability to consent to their treatment, because they were suffering from obstetric fistula, harms from giving birth. And as a result, they weren't able to carry more children to become enslaved laborers on plantations. And so the very roots of pregnancy care in America is precisely the kind of dystopian regime that Margaret Atwood was describing. So past is prologue, and we're repeating that past right now in a differently constituted way. I mean, when you have pregnant women in ICE custody who are suffering miscarriages, who are being treated inhumanely, it's hard to see any of this as being so-called pro-life.
Well, finally, you're in. It's not inevitable, I don't think, or maybe it is. But what to do about this situation? How to avoid really slipping into The Handmaid's Tale, this dystopian world, and return in some ways, you might be suggesting, even back to the America of slavery. What are we supposed to do in 2025 in Donald Trump's America?
Well, I'm struck by how much they want to erase this history and they want to prevent these stories from being told. And so one of the things that Trump has done, for example, is he has paused, but in effect canceled PRAMS, which is a pregnancy research monitoring service that actually tracks nationally morbidity and mortalities of pregnancy-related harms. They're not counting them anymore. And they have canceled research grants to people who are studying how to make maternal health better because they are being tagged as DEI and in violation of the president's executive orders. They are cutting off access to Medicaid. All of these are and by the way, they're rewriting history in the museums to not talk too much about the same enslavement that I was just talking about. And so as a journalist, obviously a journalist with a strong point of view, but fundamentally as a journalist, I want to document what is happening. I want to describe the truth of the people I write about's experiences to explain how we got here. Because even just describing this problem is now forbidden or is now being considered as sort of being negative about pregnancy.
Well, your book, I mean, no one's banning your book, are they?
No one is banning my book, but I do think the research, while I was interviewing an expert on birth equity, she found out that her grant was going to be canceled. So it's a subtler form of suppression. And I certainly have the privilege to keep my book out there. But what I'm saying is that the research and the statistics and the resources that strengthen this work are under attack. And so people, while I was working on the book, there was an effort to download and save the CDC pregnancy research data because it was literally being deleted from the website. Talk about Kafka. And so, or it's Milan Kundera, they show up and all the street signs don't exist anymore. And so I do intend this book as a call to action, but it is also fundamentally a documentation of what pregnancy actually is like. Yes, some of these stories are quite extreme, but they're emblematic of a broader policy problem. And so I think the first way to solve the problem is to diagnose it and to document it.
Well, there you have it. The book is out. It's an important book. Excellent title. Seems to cover it on lots of different fronts. Unbearable, 5 Women and the Perils of Pregnancy in America. Irin, Carmon, thanks so much. Hope we won't wait another 10 years for your next book.
Hopefully not. Thank you very much.